Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Julian Savulescu, and we're going to talk about human enhancement. All right, Professor, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Julian Savulescu. I'm the Chen Centennial Chair of Medical Ethics at the Centre for Biomedical Ethics at the National University of Singapore.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me. So you've written a lot on human enhancement. So I think it's good to just start with like a basic question, like what is human enhancement?
So human enhancement is a term that can be used in many different ways. First of all, people often think of functional enhancement, so improvement of certain functions, like having enhanced vision, enhanced cognitive ability, enhanced hearing. So these are improvements of a certain way in which humans can behave. I define enhancement more broadly. It's called a welfarist definition of enhancement as any state of biology or psychology that tends to increase a human being's well-being or their good in a given social or natural circumstance. So in that's called a welfarist definition of enhancement. So on a welfarist definition of enhancement, a particular functional enhancement may be good or bad depending on the circumstances. So it really depends on which definition you're talking about when it comes to human enhancement, because humans have functions, they have well-being, and they have other attributes that can be enhanced. So it's one of those terms that people use in different ways.
Thank you for that. So what would be a reason for somebody to enhance themselves if it were not to enhance their well-being?
Well, well-being is one good in life, but autonomy is another good that, often we sacrifice our well-being for our values. So, for example, if someone gives their life for their country or somebody risks dying to climb Mount Everest, these may not necessarily be best for their well-being, their welfare, but they promote the individual's values. So sometimes you see cases of extreme body modification that involve mutilations and risk of infection to achieve a person's vision of how they want to be. So another extreme example are people with what's called body integrity identity disorder, which where the individual feels as if one of their limbs does not belong to them, one of their healthy limbs, and they request amputation. Now, one question is whether that will improve their well-being. So will it make them happier? Will it enable them to achieve the objective goods in life, have better relationships? Another question is whether it promotes their values and whether it's the expression of autonomy and an autonomous desire. So one way in which people can enhance themselves is to promote their autonomy. Another way is to promote the well-being of other people. So at the example of giving your life to your country is an extreme example of that. But one example would be somebody who wishes to donate a kidney to other people to promote their well-being. In a medical sense, that's causing, an abnormality. But in a broader sense, it could improve people's well-being collectively.
That makes a lot of sense. So I do philosophy of well-being, so the well-being stuff appeals to me. Do you think that, like your position, like just taking this welfarist approach to human enhancement, do you think that necessarily means that you're committed to the position that disabilities are bad for you and that we should get rid of disabilities?
So that's a complicated question. The answer is yes and no. So if you take a welfarist account, then something is a capability if it tends to increase your well-being in a given social and natural circumstance, and something is a disability on a welfarist account if it tends to reduce your well-being in a given social or natural circumstance. So in a sense, capabilities are good and disabilities are bad. However, they first of all express probabilities, so they don't express certainties. So any particular state may or may not be a part of the best life. It will depend on luck and a large number of social factors, including whether social justice obtains. And secondly, if you take any particular functional characteristic, say the ability to hear or hear even more acutely, that can tend to make life better, but in certain environments it can be a disadvantage. So in a very noisy environment, having particularly acute hearing would reduce your well-being. So, I've heard anecdotes that people with perfect pitch find music often irritating because it's slightly out of tune. So in one sense, it may be an advantage. In other senses, it may be a disadvantage. So whether a particular intervention, a particular functional improvement actually translates into a better life remains uncertain. So we can't give a definitive answer to whether in the end, a particular disability will be a part of the best or a less good life. But when making decisions in advance, what we generally want to do is maximize expected utility, which means outline all the alternative courses, look at their possible outcomes, assign a probability to those outcomes and a value, and choose the action which has the greatest expected utility. So when that's applied to the human enhancement debate, it generally means that we should choose those states which will have the highest probability in a given, in a predicted social and environmental context to have the greatest chances of improving human well-being.
Okay. So there was a lot there. So I wanted to take some time to unpack it. So one of the, I guess, the counter positions that I cover in the class, I forgot what the author's name is, but basically she's coming at it from kind of like a disability rights approach. And the argument was that, well, this type of human enhancement discussion seems to focus on the individual, that the individual is the thing to change. Whereas really the problem is society, and that we should focus our energies on changing society and making society more accommodating to people with disabilities. So I think there's kind of like a shift in focus and kind of like the emphasis of what needs to change and what ought to change. It sounds like what you said is, I mean, it's kind of consistent with that, right? Because you can say, well, being, deaf or being blind, it's not necessarily worse for a person. It depends on the person's circumstances. It also going to depend on whether or not that society is accommodating to, deaf people or blind people or whoever, right? And even if you were to say that there are certain conditions that tend to lead to a lower well-being, that doesn't take away from the importance of changing society and making society more accommodating. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, exactly. So there are 4 ways to improve human well-being or to achieve any value that's important to us. You can change the natural world. You can change the social environment, social institutions, laws, practices. You can change people's psychology so that they're able to adapt to the social and natural environment better, or you can change their biology. And which of those you choose depends in part on the costs and benefits with each, and a number of ethical factors, including your own values or indeed societal values. So to say that a particular state of biology tends to reduce well-being doesn't imply that we have to change biology to improve human well-being. It can be accommodated by external technology, social change. So, when I was a kid, I'm very old now, but there was a film called, a series called The $6 Million Man with Lee Majors, who was an astronaut who lost his limbs in an accident. And they had at this point in the future bionic limbs. So he had bionic superpowers related to these bionic limbs. So, losing a limb or losing 2 limbs or losing 4 limbs would not be a disadvantage if we had technology so advanced that artificial limbs were superior to natural limbs. In fact, it would, you would be able to enjoy an enhancement through technology. So, which one we should change is an open question. The view that you're contrasting, which Elizabeth Barnes is famous for articulating recently, is sometimes called the social constructivist view or the social injustice view of disability, which says that all of the badness associated with what are commonly termed disabilities, such as blindness, deafness, paralysis, intellectual disability, are the result of the way in which society is constructed. And that if we change the way in which society was constructed, people with so-called disabilities would have just as happy and fulfilling lives. And I agree there's certainly an element of truth to that view, that if we did change society a lot more, we had many more wheelchair facilities, many more ramps, many more elevators. I've even argued that children should learn sign language in primary school as their second language, and that would improve the well-being of people with deafness. There's no doubt about that. My question is, would it completely eliminate, first of all, would it completely eliminate all of the disadvantage associated today with what are called disabilities? And I don't believe it would. So, for example, with deafness, you wouldn't be able to hear auditory warnings from the environment. You wouldn't be able to experience music. So there would still be some disadvantages, even if everyone was able to sign. And secondly, the view often conflates justice with equality. It has a view that as long as there's any kind of inequality, injustice exists. And that's an extremely demanding view that nobody, I think really accepts when they reflect on it, because it means that we would have to accommodate every single difference in human beings. So, for example, door frames would have to be, increased everywhere by 2 feet because there are some extremely tall people who they will disadvantage. We think that absolute equality is not a plausible account of justice. Generally, something like utilitarianism or prioritarianism or sufficientarianism define what justice requires, not absolute equality.
Where do you think the most important aspects of human beings should be enhanced? What do you think is the most important to change in order to get the most bang for our buck in terms of increasing well-being? Do you think it's cognitive enhancement?
Well, actually, it's probably increasing health span. Or well-being span, so probably extending people's lives in ways in which they can continue to enjoy well-being. If you could double human lifespan as in a way that the individual was healthy and able still to lead a fulfilling life, that will be an incredible achievement, and that's been achieved in non-human animals. So the Methuselah mouse, is genetically engineered and lives twice as long. But apart from life extension technologies, I think what matters most to us are our cognitive lives, the way in which we experience the world, the way in which we're able to form values, to be original, to be creative, to achieve those values. Those all require some level of physical ability, but technology has given us enormous physical abilities. What is the limiting factor are our cognitive abilities. Now, it's true that computers, large language models, artificial intelligence in general are all increasing our cognitive capacities. But in general, humans are often thwarted by their emotions. Now, our emotions make up what's valuable in our life and are very important to it, but they also can cause extraordinary anger, rage that lead people to murder or commit other violent offences. So people have impulses that they give into that mean that they go for short-term rewards that are much smaller and have long-term costs, and don't go for long-term rewards. So there are many aspects of our psychology that are far from perfect and represent impediments to our well-being. And I think our psychological lives are the area where there would be most bang for our buck. So a couple of traits that, I think that there is some evidence that they would increase people's well-being is, first of all, impulse control, the ability to delay gratification. Walter Mischel's marshmallow experiments, although they've been criticised in many ways, I think there is still an element of truth to the fact that people need the ability to delay gratification, and that's the basis for treating attention deficit disorder with drugs like Ritalin, which is a form of cognitive enhancement. Another example would be general intelligence, or G. That's the ability to draw inferences from the information that is available to an individual and form rational beliefs about the world or themselves or other people. So that essentially gives you more knowledge and control over the world, whatever you want to do. And artificial intelligence and computing and the internet are expressions, are other examples of what the value of intelligence is and what it contributes to people's lives. So, I think being more beautiful, being stronger, being faster, having better musical abilities, having better functional abilities are all important to a degree, but we are essentially our minds and our mental lives. And I think that human enhancement that can iron out some of the wrinkles of evolution would be something that we should aim for.
So it seems to me that your approach, or one's approach to human enhancement, it's going to be strongly informed by, I guess, what that person thinks about well-being, like what theory of well-being that that person adopts, right? Do you have any particular theory that you lean towards?
So I think the most important question in bioethics and in the world today is what is human well-being? So Bhutan has their gross happiness index. And I think this is an extremely important question, not just for human enhancement, for how we organise society, how we structure education, how we evaluate technology, how we implement medicine. It's the common currency of ethics. Ethics is about, maybe not entirely, but it's about improving human well-being or well-being of sentient beings. So we need to have an account. So traditionally there are three accounts: hedonistic account, which say that what matters is happiness, what Bhutan has adopted. Secondly, there are desire fulfillment or preference satisfaction views, which say that what matters is people satisfying preferences. And then in economics, that's kind of narrowed down to people's rational preferences. So economics is a desire fulfillment view of human well-being. And then there are objectivist approaches that say that, humans are animals, that certain functions represent a flourishing life for that animal, that's what that animal is meant to do. And characteristics of human lives are they're social beings, so having deep and rich social relationships, having and raising children, gaining knowledge, they're curious beings, originality and creativity, developing their talents, and so on. So there's a kind of a list of activities. And my view, which I've taken from Derek Parfit, is I think that the best life is the one which is at the intersection of all three of those views, where the individual is engaged in good activities for a human being that gives them happiness, that they come to desire to engage in. Now, as Aristotle taught, we need to develop good habits. So part of child rearing is cultivating a child's desires for things that are good for them, and that, enabling them to gain happiness from those activities. So I have a partly objectivist view. So I mentioned Elizabeth Barnes and her views around disability. And often in that debate, people say, well, look, people who, have paraplegia are just as happy with their lives as people, that don't have paraplegia. What happens after you become paralyzed? This is a period of depression where well-being or happiness goes down, and then you adapt and you are just as happy or nearly as happy. Now, I think that's true, and I think that many of the states that are associated with disability are not as bad as people think. But that's not to say that that period of loss isn't bad. So if I lose my wife dies, I will adapt to it. I will, in the long term, be just as happy. But it's still bad for me. And it's bad also because I've lost somebody I love that impoverishes my life in an objective way. So I think where I disagree with people who take a purely subjective view, that is purely hedonistic or purely desire fulfillment view, is that I think our lives can be going worse in an objective sense, even if they're going just as well in a subjective sense. So I have a partly objective, partly subjective view of well-being.
How does human enhancement differ from eugenics?
Eugenics literally means well-born, and it refers to the practices in the 19th and 20th century of using knowledge of heredity or primitive knowledge of genetics to try to have children who were, first of all, less likely to be intellectually disabled, less likely to be criminals, and less likely to be poor, and less likely to be mentally ill. And the eugenicists of those times thought that those conditions were largely genetically determined, and that you, by having selective breeding, just as you could produce, better peas or better vegetables or better animals, you could produce better human beings. So that was picked up socially and implemented as a social policy using coercion, for example, in voluntary sterilization of people deemed to be genetically unfit. And it reached its low point with the Nazi T4 programs and extermination of people thought to be genetically unfit, the murder of innocent people. So what characterized Nazi eugenics and the eugenics of the 19th and 20th century were, first of all, a state vision of how society should be, that we want a fitter society. Secondly, it was based on bad science and bad understandings of genetics. And thirdly, it was a kind of social Darwinist view about society. And lastly, and probably most importantly, it was imposed on people involuntarily. So clinical genetics today aims for people to give people the option of having a child that is healthier, that may not have intellectual disability, that may not have a genetic cause of mental illness, but it's offered as a choice to people based on plausible science and plausible views of the well-being of the future child, not on an implausible view about how society ought to be organised. And people are free to reject it. They're free to accept or reject genetic screening and genetic testing. And that's quite different to the eugenic practices. In one sense, it is eugenic, but in the sense of it being coercive, based on a state vision of how society ought to be ordered, that's racist and social Darwinist. It's not eugenics. So, human enhancement intersects with eugenics in terms of aiming at having, a future generation where children are healthier, have better opportunities in life. It diverges in terms of the values that inform that human enhancement, and it's focused on the well-being of that individual, and it's liberal. People are allowed to choose to refuse either genetic selection or biological interventions that might enhance their well-being. Indeed, people can choose a whole range of things that reduce their well-being today in order to promote their own autonomy.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding you correctly, the eugenics of the past, like the bad eugenics, that was top-down and that was involuntary. What you're advocating is more like a grassroots. It's not necessarily like a movement, but you want it to be voluntary. People can choose it. People could choose against it. And it's not like there is one central government that has this particular vision of well-being. The individual person can act on their own conception of well-being. The parents can operate according to their own conception of well-being and so on.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it sounds radical, but actually it's something we do all the time. So education is aimed at improving people's well-being, and enhancing their ability to control their own lives and be autonomous. It's also aimed at producing a kind of more cohesive, secure, stable society. Diet is aimed at improving human well-being. We do so many things in our lives which are human enhancements. Our life is all about human enhancement. What we're talking about really is human bioenhancement. That is, using biological interventions to directly improve human well-being rather than using education or diet or social or intervention. And there is no reason to treat biological interventions that promote human well-being differently to social or psychological interventions that promote human well-being, because all of them operate through the final common pathway of modifying our brains and our biology and the firing of our neurons. Some of them do that through several intermediary steps, but ultimately what happens is neuronal firing. And, you can change that neuronal firing by learning to ride a bicycle or denying a child love, and that will have effects on their brain, just as a drug or a genetic intervention will have effects on their brain. So I think people will have this mystery around biology that somehow it's kind of sacrosanct and that we should never intervene. And I think we should be, careful when we intervene. And, I'm loath to take medications, and I don't take, a lot of human enhancements because of the side effects. But in principle, there's nothing different. That we need to evaluate its costs and benefits, and if it makes our lives better, we should use it.
Yeah. When I teach this subject, I always ask my students what they think and about, this particular enhancement or that particular enhancement. And what you quickly realize is that the vast majority of people will share, I guess, basic intuitions about what is fundamentally good for us, right? I mean, they may differ on the specifics, but they're very basic things, like almost like basic goods that people agree on, like health, right? Like none of my students think that being unhealthy is good for them, So if there is something that can improve their health, they're usually for it. Cognitive enhancement seems to be quite favored by my students when I poll them. Right? They tend to value intelligence. I ask them, what about humor? Like if you could be more funny, that one, it's like mixed, maybe like 30% raise their hand. The lesson that I draw from that is that human enhancement will get more support if what we're talking about are like very fundamental things. So I think it's really good that you said that, primarily maybe the biggest change that we can make in terms of increasing our well-being is lengthening our health span. Right? Because I think a lot of people can get behind that. Same thing with like the cognitive enhancement stuff.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I think there's another dimension to it. So, first of all, we have this idea of sort of basic kind of things that should be enhanced and things which are kind of less clear. And that's fair enough. I think, that's a debate we need to have. But there's another thing, which is the nature bias. I mean, people are, in favor of something if it occurs in nature and it can improve our lives in some way. They're slightly less accepting, but still accepting if we kind of create a pharmaceutical, a kind of tablet that is derived from that natural substance. They can sort of still, that's it to the interface. Then if there's something which is injected, they're kind of even more reluctant to take it, even if it's the same substance that occurs in nature. And then if there was a genetic intervention that, achieved the same outcome as taking that drug, they would be, that's a sort of a kind of bright line, even though the biological effects may be exactly the same. So to give you an example of this, of this nature bias, this is the kind of absurdity of sort of folk ethics. So doping in sport is about performance enhancement in sport, and it works. So one form of enhancement is increasing the amount of red blood cells in your blood because you can carry more oxygen, you can perform better in endurance events such as long distance running or cycling. So there are 4 ways currently that you can, although there's a 5th way now, but the 4 standard ways are that you can increase the number of red blood cells is you can just go and train at altitude. You can go and train in Nepal or, on the top of some mountain, and your body will naturally produce red blood cells. No problem with that. People are completely accepting of that. It's not illegal. Science has also reproduced the effects of altitude by creating a hypoxic air tent, which is a kind of capsule that you go into, which has lower oxygen, like being at altitude, but you're in your own home. So you can even create a house with sort of low oxygen to sort of training. Again, no problem with that. People accept that, but probably less, embracing as sort of altitude training, but it's not illegal. They both have exactly the same effect. They increase your red blood cell count. Another thing you can do is you can go and donate, a unit of blood 3 months before an event, and your body will replace it, and it can be transfused by an intravenous line, and that will increase your red blood cells to exactly the same degree as the other 2. But that's illegal because it involves a needle and a kind of, an IV line. And then you can also take the drug EPO, which is the hormone that your body secretes when you're at altitude or when you need more red blood cells. Then again, that's completely natural. And yet people, because it involves an injection of an artificial substance, that's illegal. You could also genetically modify human beings. Monkeys have been genetically modified to produce more red blood cells. Some humans, have these natural mutations, such as the Finnish skier, Eero Taranta. I can't pronounce his name, but anyway, he had a natural mutation that meant he produced, a much larger number of red blood cells and won medals at the Olympics. And there's also now a worm called a lugworm, which you can take that increases your red blood cells, and that would be illegal. But all of these have the same effect, but they just differ in terms of the way in which they increase. And for me, what matters is what should our red blood cell count be? What's safe? What's fair? What's going to improve performance, reduce injury, allow training, provide spectacle? All of these values should determine which of these we allow, not the fact that, one involves an intravenous line or one's classified as a human enhancement.
Yeah, I do get the sense that there's disagreement on like 2 different dimensions. Like one dimension is like the values and the goals, and the other dimension is the means, right? Like the how we're going to achieve these things. And even when we're talking about values and goals that we all tend to share, like something like health, perhaps people are less willing to accept it if we're talking about like genetic manipulation versus something like exercise. No one's going to be against like exercise, all right? So this leads to my next question, which is about procreative beneficence. That's the other article that I cover in my class. Can you briefly describe what that is?
Procreative beneficence is the principle that couples, have a moral obligation or a pro tanto moral obligation or moral reason to select the best child of the possible children they could have. Best meaning having the best chance of the best life. So if you have 10 embryos and you're having IVF, you should use the information about those embryos not just to select the embryo which has the lowest chance of disease, but also the highest chance of a life with high levels of well-being. So people say this is sort of very controversial to say that people have an obligation, but what I mean by obligation is that's what you should do. It's not the eugenic ideal that you must be compelled to do that. It's about what we should advise people to do, and we should enable them to do and try to encourage them to do. So an example of procreative beneficence is when the Zika epidemic was, at its peak. Both the Centre for Disease Control in the US and Public Health England in the UK advised people who were coming back from a Zika-infested area, such as Brazil, to delay reproduction if they were thinking of having a child by 3 months. So they They didn't say, look, if you have a child when you immediately get back, there's a risk that you will have, the child will contract Zika, and that will cause microcephaly and intellectual disability. But the choice is yours. Do what you want. They said, you should wait 3 months. Now, if you wait 3 months, the sperm and the egg that produced the child will be different to the sperm and the egg that would have produced the child if you had one when you immediately got back from Brazil. So what they're saying is, if there are two possible children, one which has Zika and the other which doesn't, you should select the one that doesn't have Zika. And the reason for that is because Zika is associated with microcephaly and intellectual disability, and intellectual disability is a disadvantage. It's a bad thing and something that we should avoid and develop, treatments to cure. So that was an example of procreative beneficence, which said you should select the child who is expected. Now, you can phrase it as expected not to have intellectual disability or expected to have a higher IQ. It depends on how you want to phrase that. But it's essentially an expression of procreative beneficence. So procreative beneficence is an extremely commonsensical view. It just that people, their anxieties are provoked by sort of the idea of the eugenics of the 19th or 20th century. But, if somebody said to you, look, if you wait 3 months, your child will be more likely to be able to enter university than if you have a child now, many people would wait. In fact, that's what a study in science showed, that people thought that, even if you had a small increase in the ability of, you should use genetic selection and polygenic scores to select embryos that have a higher chance of becoming children who have the opportunity to go to university. So that's an expression of procreative beneficence.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think if I were, a prospective parent, I would probably wait those 3 months as well. But I don't know if I would necessarily do it for the sake of my child. I think I would do it for the sake of me and my wife, right? Because I would think that it would be more difficult and more stressful to raise a child with, microcephaly or whatever the disability might be. And the reason why I would lean towards that reason and not the other reason, which is like for the sake of my child, is because like this non-identity problem. And I was hoping that you could explain maybe how you think about the non-identity problem and whether or not it's like a defeater for your position.
So the non-identity problem was first described by Derek Parf. It's a very complicated idea. It's where we're trying to evaluate an act which leads to some loss of well-being in the future, but that act is necessary for that individual to exist. So the best way I can describe it is by using an example. Generally, when we think of harm and benefit to people, what's called person-affecting harm, we think about actions that make that individual better off or worse off than they would otherwise have been. So sometimes people who are themselves deaf and are part of the deaf community argue that deafness is not a disability, it's a difference, and that the deaf culture is a unique culture. So they want to have a child, they deliberately want to have a child who's deaf. So one way in which you can have a child who's deaf is to refuse a cochlear implant to a child who is born deaf. So that child will remain deaf. Another way would be to take a hearing child and give a drug or perform a surgery so that child goes from being able to hear to being deaf. In both cases, you have a child who could be hearing or could be deaf. In both of these cases, both the drug surgery case and the refusal of cochlear implant, you're, in my view, inflicting a person-affecting harm if you deny the child the ability to hear, because they can still be a part of the deaf community, they can still sign as well as hear and speak. It's like having the ability to be a part of two cultures or speak two languages rather than one. But that's an example of a person-affecting harm. Another way to have a deaf child is to, if you're a deaf couple and you're at risk of having a child with genetic deafness, is to have IVF, produce 10 embryos, and test those embryos to see which will be hearing and which will be deaf, and to select a deaf one. Or, as has also happened, to select a deaf sperm donor, or, to use the gametes from somebody who has deafness running in the family and create a new child who's deaf. Now, that child, is deaf, but could that child have been hearing? No. If the couple had selected a different embryo, it would have been a different child who would have been hearing. So instead of deaf Danny, there would have been hearing Harry. So that child hasn't been harmed in that person-affecting sense. That's the non-identity problem. That if we think that in this case where the child's existence is dependent on the act, if we think there is something wrong with selecting a deaf embryo, it's not to do with person-affecting harm. And Derek Parfit said there is this impersonal harm that is involved in having a child that has less well-being, that we should still, and Procreative beneficence says you should have the child that doesn't have the microcephaly or the deafness. But it's not like cutting a child's auditory nerves. So I think people have a reason to have children who have more opportunities, but if they don't, it should still be legal, even though cutting your child's auditory nerves should be illegal. So in fact, the law says it's in the UK, it's illegal to select a deaf embryo. I think that's wrong. I think it should be legal. I think people should be allowed to do that because of the non-identity problem, that whatever is wrong with it is different to what's wrong with, cutting a child's auditory nerves. Now you might say, what is this sort of impersonal harm? If the child is happy and they're deaf, what's the problem? You've selected one child rather than another. Well, in fact, the whole of climate change policy is based on there being these impersonal wrongs, because when you reduce carbon emissions, you change the timing of reproduction so that different people come into existence. You're using different forms of transport, you're deciding to have intercourse at a different time. The whole world is different. So in the long term, there will be a different future population who will have lives which have more well-being than if you continue to emit carbon. But if you continued to emit carbon, it would be like selecting the deaf child. You would be bringing about different people whose lives would be dependent on you continuing to emit carbon, and their lives would be worse, but they wouldn't be harmed. Now, most people think we should bring about the better population because they think there is something to procreative beneficence. And even though there is a non-identity problem, we should still bring about future generations that have higher levels of well-being. You're completely correct. In the microcephaly case, there's also the interests of the parents. That is a reason. But Parfit and I argue that there is a separate reason to do with well-being that isn't as strong as person-affecting reasons, but is still a consideration. That's what drives the advice of the CDC and Public Health England. They're not saying, you should wait because it'll be difficult for you. They're saying you should wait because you should avoid having a child, affected by Zika if you can avoid it.
Thank you for bringing up the topic of climate change. I hadn't thought about it in that term, like in terms of the non-identity problem. But yeah, that does make sense. And I think intuitively, I would bring about the population that suffers less from climate change, even though the act of it makes it such that that future group is different than the other future group. Yeah. So yeah, I guess I do find it intuitive that we want to reduce, impersonal harm. Or yeah.
I mean, if you want to have it, let me be clear. If you come back from Brazil and you want to have a child right now, I think you should be allowed, and I think you should be supported and the child should be supported and we should be free to do that. Just as I think that if deaf couples want to have a child with deafness and they use selection technologies, they should be allowed to do that and supported to do that because, that child, will have a good life. They'll be loved by their parents. They'll be part of an accepting community. We should be supporting those differences. Does that make it the best decision? In my view, no. But, people should be allowed to make their own decisions, and provided that Now, this is another basic tenet of ethics. People should be free as long as they're not harming somebody. Now, when you cut a child's auditory nerves, you're harming that child. You're making that child worse off. Now, some people will disagree with that. On the social constructivist view, that's not true. As long as that child's in an environment where they're supported by a community and a culture, that's not wrong. But we can't accept relativism in the absolute sense. We have to take a stand on this, particularly when we make laws. So one restriction to people's freedom is when they're going to harm somebody. Now, when you decide to have a child immediately after coming back from Brazil, you're not harming anyone. You're not harming that child, as long as that child will have a life that's worth living, which they almost certainly will. Then you should be free to do that. But that's not what the Nazi eugenics program sort of was about.
Yeah, no, thank you for that clarification, because that was going to be my next question, right? Because if you want if you want these technologies to be used in legal, that means there's going to be some level of regulation, right? So then the question is, well, how should they be regulated? What actions should be prevented and which ones should be allowed? If we're going to operate with some sort of liberal political philosophy where the government doesn't adopt a comprehensive conception of the good, then what is the threshold? Where does the government draw the line of what you cannot do? Your response is, well, you can't harm the child, right?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to give up on this idea that the Liberal government can't adopt a comprehensive conception of the good. Well, again, it depends on what you mean by comprehensive conception, but we have to have some conception of the good. So when Jehovah's Witnesses refuse blood transfusions for their children, courts order blood transfusions because they take a view that, and very rightly, that the child has an interest in life and not dying for the sake of their parents' particular religious beliefs. Now, when that child becomes an adult, they're free to refuse blood transfusions themselves and die as a result of it. But we take a view that that's harming the child. So likewise, if parents want to have a club foot amputated rather than have protracted splinting for 5 years of the child's life, we have to take a view on, is that going to harm the child or benefit the child? If parents want to refuse Ritalin for their child, is that going to harm the child or benefit the child? So, unfortunately, we can't just go back to the old conceptions of disease and health as being the only determinants of good. Now there's not just cancer and heart disease and streptococcal infection. There are many ways of affecting cognitive function and psychological well-being that we have to take a stand, particularly when it comes to children. For adults, we can say, look, here are the facts. You decide for yourself based on your autonomy whether you want to accept it. If somebody's got a disorder that's going to progressively result in the loss of their cognitive function, such as Alzheimer's disease or dementia, and there's an effective drug, we can, let them decide whether they think it's just a difference, and they can act on that. But when it comes to a child, and you can prevent the development of Alzheimer's disease later by an intervention, but only if done at, the prenatal or embryonic stage, we have to take a stand. Is that a good thing for the child or a bad thing? And I think it's a good thing to prevent Alzheimer's disease. And you could do that by selecting against ApoE4, which is a genetic allele associated very strongly with, particularly when you have two copies, with the later development of Alzheimer's disease. Now, what I think the state should do, and here understanding the non-identity problem is very important, is distinguish between interventions that biological interventions, particularly genetic interventions, that involve person-affecting harm, which should fall within the conventional kind of laws that we have, but we do need now to have a comprehensive conception of the good in order to decide when they involve harm and benefit. Separate those from genetic selection decisions, which involve embryo selection and the non-identity problem, and they don't involve person-affecting harm. So they should be much more lightly legislated, in my view. So I think, again, it's important to understand both the science and the philosophy in order to regulate human enhancements. There's a big difference between genetic selection, selecting embryos that have either been created naturally or artificially, versus gene editing, which modifies embryos, because one involves the non-identity problem, the other doesn't.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. So we can imagine that very soon we're going to come to a period where CRISPR is going to be like standard medical treatment, right? So if it's the case where doctors know that, this embryo that these parents selected is going to suffer from, sickle cell disease, right? Then it may be the case that if the parents refuse to treat the embryo with CRISPR, that the state would have to step in.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got, a catastrophic genetic disorder that you would not be able to refuse treatment for after birth, if gene editing is just as safe as those interventions, then, courts should authorize those treatments. There's a mystery around genes. They think that there's something kind of special. Genes just produce proteins, and proteins just affect function. So you can either give the protein to replace the missing protein because of a genetic abnormality, or you can correct the gene so the body produces the protein itself all the time, so you don't have to take a daily drug. And so, if we would require the administration of a drug or some surgery or some medical intervention, that often has a lot of side effects and costs, and we could instead do very safe gene editing at what would be a very low cost, then the state might mandate that, just as they mandate blood transfusions. Now, where do you draw the line? Would this extend? For example, I mentioned the ApoE4 gene. Should we be gene editing the ApoE4 gene in embryos to prevent Alzheimer's disease at the end of their life? Well, it will depend on the knowledge around ApoE4. If there's what's called pleiotropy, that is, the genes can have multiple effects, not just bad effects, but good effects, and how those good and bad effects balance out in the likely context of that child. And then there's the safety itself of the gene editing. But that will be a question that people of the future may have to face. And then there will be, if we could add 20 IQ points to this particular embryo by multiple safe gene edits, and we understand sufficiently the sort of pleiotropy of those gene edits. Now, that's a lot further into the future, but it will begin, I think, by gene editing of catastrophic lethal diseases like Tay-Sachs disease, where there's potential benefits and very few risks because the child will die anyway. To then, childhood onset diseases, then adult onset diseases, then late adult onset diseases, then perhaps to more, wider forms of human enhancement. But they're all on a continuum, and it's really a cost-benefit ratio around, what's most likely to promote well-being.
The last question is in regards to unintended consequences. So this kind of touches back on what we discussed earlier, which is this sort of fear of genetic manipulation, right? And I was wondering if you think that there are going to be certain unintended consequences, and if you think that there are going to be, like, what are they?
Well, I mean, the biggest one is risks. Nothing in life is 100% safe. So. Yeah, whatever bar you set for safety, there will always be remaining risks that won't, and those harms won't be intended, but they will be a real prospect. So you can't, in a probabilistic world, ever guarantee the outcome, and that applies to gene editing as it applies to pharmaceuticals, as it applies to surgery, it applies to walking across the road. So the biggest one is going to be safety. The next one is what I've described as pleiotropy. This is a feature of single genes, but often large numbers of genes together acting that have beneficial or one set of effects in one context, but another set of effects in another context. So, for example, increasing IQ is associated with autism spectrum disorders. Manic depression may be associated with creativity. Genes won't come as just, it's going to make you more X. There's going to be more X, Y, and Z, or there's going to be a higher probability of X, Y, and Z. So, for example, I was asked to comment on a Nature Human Behavior paper, where they found a polygenic score that predicted same-sex behavior. That is, people who have, at some point in their life, a sexual experience with a person of the same sex. So this is the sort of so-called genes, in this case, for homosexuality. But this polygenic score also was associated with more openness to experience, a more risk-taking, more charisma. So and also having more female partners if you were male. So it explained this paradox of why a genetic disposition to same-sex behavior has persisted through human beings. So it's not that, you will have a disposition to being gay. You will have a whole package of dispositions that the environment will affect a lot, and they may never come to express themselves. And it's not going to be clearly good or bad in any way. It's going to be very difficult to evaluate. So I think pleiotropy is a big problem for human enhancement. But, ethics is not black and white. It's black, white, and grey. And the grey zone is probably much bigger than we realise. But that doesn't mean there isn't a black and white zone, and there won't be some things that are clearly enhancements. Other unintended effects will be the way in which we react to people. So the so-called living in the shadow objection, or, I've called it genism. We may treat people differently because of their genetic origin, or the fact that they have experienced biological manipulations, and that may harm them. That may be unintended but foreseeable. There's also reduction in genetic diversity. People are concerned that if this is used at scale, it may reduce. People may narrow on a particular set of characteristics that would reduce genetic diversity, and that may expose us to vulnerabilities to infection, or it can also have collective effects. I think unintended collective effects, where the sum of individual choices have negative social consequences. So, for example, introversion and extroversion both have genetic contributions as kind of personality styles. And extroversion is sometimes associated with various advantages socially. Now, what probably worked, or what may work best for society, is a mixture of introverts and extroverts. But people, individual couples, or individuals themselves may choose to be more extroverted, and that may have negative social consequences. So I think those collective effects are likely also to be important in the human enhancement debate. So, we've written a paper on collective human enhancement. So, there's individual welfarist human enhancement, and then collectivist welfarist human enhancement. So what is best for the collective? Now, what restrictions should you place on individuals for the sake of the collective? That's a question, a kind of question around tragedy of the commons, climate change, antimicrobial resistance. So what sacrifices should we make to benefit the collective? And that's an eternal moral question. How do you balance self-interest versus morality? And in my view, we should only impose small costs on the individual for large collective benefits. But that's, again, a debate to be had.
All right. Thank you for that. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Chris. My pleasure.